So you're safe between now and February. You won't see a PSM rule issued. A new regulatory agenda will be issued sometime this fall. We get that twice a year, so that's your marker. Every time that's issued, you can see, has it popped up to short term? Is there specific action planned? When they get around to that, right, we know they want to do something. We know they're having conversations. We know that they're participating in listening sessions with EPA as they work on RMP issues. We know things are happening. It's not all still under the water, but what comes next? We've listed here the three things that we think are possible. Maybe they're the most likely, maybe not. It's hard to say at this point. We could just see a published rule, right? There could be a proposed rule published, and then industry could submit comments on that. That's one way. I think it would be a bit of a surprise after this long delay, but I don't think it'd be terribly shocking when it comes to rulemaking. We could also see a new RFI issued if there are new, if OSHA's learned something over the past 5 or 8 years, whether it's through EPA's saga of their RMP rule or maybe industry developments, they could issue a new RFI and solicit new input. That would be a softer way to start it. You could also see them go back and do things with the SBA. That seems like a low probability. We have a full SBREFA report there, so that to me seems like the least likely of the possibilities. But they'll have to find some way to move things forward soon. Regardless what way they do it, we expect collaboration or coordination with the EPA, and we hope that it will be a little better coordination than we saw in 2016, 2017, where we had a new RMP rule and no PSM rule. So before we leave this topic, wanted to flag, bring back an old slide from literally 5 years ago. This is what we collected from the time when the SBREFA report was issued. There were about 20 issues or so that were flagged that could be addressed in rulemaking. As we noted, there's a lot of overlap between the original RMP rulemaking, at least the proposed rule. You'll recall there were a lot more elements in that than there were in the final RMP amendments. And then we listed here some of the major things that were on the list. Some of the most concerning, I think, for me would be something like the atmospheric storage tank exemption, things related to the safer technology alternatives analysis, defining or updating RAGA gap. Those are all very, very sensitive issues. There's a host of other possibilities. So what we know at this point is what we knew 4 or 5 years ago. But stay tuned. We'll find out more when OSHA starts doing things above the surface. We'll be watching for that and giving new updates whenever those are available. With that, we'll leave that behind, move on to your and my favorite topic, the implications of the Wynnewood decision. I feel like anytime I present on this, I need to apologize because I don't think I've given a presentation for the last 4 or 5 years without talking about it. But it was and still is one of the biggest things in process safety. So I wouldn't feel good without talking about it at some level. If you are new to this issue, I'm going to apologize because I will not give you enough background to understand it. There's lots of places you can go and read about it. But for a quick recap, a quick summary, there is a refinery in Wynnewood, Oklahoma that had an explosion in a boiler's firebox. OSHA inspected, issued a number of citations under the PSM standard related to that particular boiler. The refinery took the position that it was not, the PSM standard did not require it to be covered because it was a boiler, it was a utility, it had water, it didn't contain HHCs. OSHA took the opposite view. And at the initial appellate level at OSHRC, the commission concluded that the boiler was interconnected with covered processes because of the interconnection between the steam header and then also with the refinery fuel gas. On the topic of co-location, because of course you can have PSM coverage either through interconnection or co-location, OSHRC ruled that OSHA only needed to prove that it was possible for a highly hazardous chemical to be involved in potential release. A position that we thought was entirely too speculative, but that's where they landed. after appellate work at the 10th Circuit that took up a lot of time and a lot of energy. Unfortunately, the 10th Circuit affirmed the OSHRC decision, really just affirming it nearly straight up. They included some language that was somewhat concerning. We highlighted that here. They flagged the fact that nothing in the definition of process of the PSM standard explicitly requires a vessel to contain highly hazardous chemicals in order to be PSM covered, right? So if you were holding in your head the idea, like I think many of us were, that you couldn't legitimately extend PSM coverage to a vessel that held something that wasn't a highly hazardous chemical, be that water, steam, things like that, the 10th Circuit said no. They read the definition of process to allow that. They also read the any activity language in the definition of process very, very broadly to reinforce their conclusion that it didn't have to, the vessel itself didn't have to contain a highly hazardous chemical. You know, that anytime a court interprets broad language broadly, it gives me great pause. That's why we've flagged it here. The other major conclusion here that we thought was concerning is that interconnection alone is enough to establish coverage. OSHA doesn't need to prove the potential for some causal relationship between the vessel with HHCs and another vessel, including a boiler that only contains water. There was a dissent in the case, and that particular judge rejected the majority's reasoning, adopting Wynnewood's arguments, basically contradicting everything here. Unfortunately, that was the dissent had one judge, and the majority opinion had two judges, and that's how decisions are made. So I've included here our initial employer takeaways. So these were written immediately after the decision was issued, and I would categorize this as probably worst case scenario writing here, right? This is maybe not the worst possible, but this is all right. If this decision is as bad as we think it is, here's what it means. In just a second on the next slide, I'll maybe moderate myself just a little bit. But okay, so what do we have here? OSHA's their wish to expand PSM coverage. They've been trying to do this for decades. They've got it. Watch them go now. Because of this decision, they can issue PSM citations for literally anything inside the fence line. Watch them trying to just use their interconnection purple crayons and connect all the dots, and you'll see it, and they'll hit you with PSM everywhere. And of course, this is in the middle of the new ChemRef NEP. They now have a tool to walk into your facility and to use this new expanded coverage definition. And so our takeaway was, expect OSHA to treat utilities as covered by a PSM. Maybe you need to voluntarily cover your utilities with PSM. Maybe you keep separate documentation that says we don't think this is right, but we're going to do it anyway. And who knows, maybe you need to consider whether you need to do design changes to prevent OSHA from applying PSM to certain parts of your facility, right? I believe some of that, but maybe some of it's a little overblown. So after a little more time to think about it and reflect, some time to talk to OSHA people, here's where some additional things that I would add to the previous slide. The people we've talked to in enforcement have said, and they said repeatedly while rolling their eyes at statements like those on the previous slide, they have said that the Wynnewood decision just affirms what OSHA has been saying all along. It's not new, it's not expanded coverage, it's the same coverage we've always known. We have heard OSHA personnel say in public on the record that they don't intend to extend PSM coverage to hit everything inside the fence. The counterpoint I'll lay to that is, one of the things, the arguments that came up in the Wynnewood litigation was, what's your limiting principle? If you say interconnection alone is enough and it can cover vessels that don't contain HHCs, I don't understand how you can. You can tell me I won't be ridiculous and apply it to your toilets, but the principle that isn't there. You can promise me all you want to, you won't do it. But I just don't see it. Our thinking on this has kind of taken us in an interesting direction, and so maybe we need to go back to some of the OSHA interpretation letters from the last 15 or 20 years that were pushing, at least as we saw it, pushing PSM coverage to be broader, including the 2008 letter on utility systems. I'm sure you all have read that. What's interesting about that one is that there the focus is on PSM coverage extending as a result of potential consequences, which I find to be baffling given the fact that OSHA in the Wynnewood case argued that they didn't need to prove potential consequences, a potential effect on a covered process, but we'll leave that aside for now. But essentially in that letter, they say you need to be including in your PHA failures that could cause a release. So if your utility system, if the failure of the utility system could cause a release, you need to cover the potential of that failure in your PHA. You need to consider that possibility as you're doing PSM, which to me sounds similar to the arguments that Wynnewood made for what the standard ought to require, and certainly doesn't signal that OSHA is going to be extending PSM to include toilets, right? Or to say where's your mechanical integrity records for your water lines for your control room. It doesn't seem like they're going that way. So really the question is, what do we do? We know that the world seems different. OSHA has this new legal precedent when they want to cite things that maybe industry didn't think ought to be included as PSM covered facilities. What do we do? How do we approach that? One thing is what I just said. Consider that 2008 letter on utility systems, see what it says, see how it layers in PSM coverage. I think you'll find that it doesn't necessarily say you need full coverage for all of your utility systems. It really flags some of the hazard review type situations. That's really where you need to be focusing. Another option, we've talked about this with some of our clients, is to consider a coverage strategy of, I call it HHC +1. You have vessels that have highly hazardous chemicals. Clearly, they're covered. There's no dispute about that. But then you leave it and you get to the next vessel. Maybe you've got a mixture that's no longer flammable, or maybe the mixture no longer has sufficient toxics in it to be covered, or maybe the next vessel only has water in it. One thing that you could do, an approach you could try, is to say, all right, I'm going to cover the first vessel past the highly hazardous chemicals. According to our reading of the rule, you shouldn't have to, right? You ought to be able to cut coverage at that point. But if you're trying to be conservative, you're trying to make sure that you're not surprised at some point during an OSHA inspection. If you go highly hazardous chemical +1, you will, I think, be covering those pieces of equipment that OSHA seems to be saying must be covered. And then you can make the argument that if you're at HHC +2, we're now into the level of the absurd. You're not talking about, our toilets, but come on, we're well separated from the actual process, and there's really no chance for this second vessel down in sequence to actually affect the process. If it can, then I think you ought to be thinking about how you're dealing with it in your PSM coverage. But anyway, that's an opening thought on ways that you may approach that. I know that every site is going to have different considerations, risks, and probably a different approach, but that's something you can start out with. The last thing I'll add here is what we've been recommending is that you be absolutely clear on your company's position on PSM coverage. If OSHA shows up, does an inspection, particularly if it's after an incident, and they say, give me your mechanical integrity records and your PHA for this boiler or for this vessel that may or may not be covered. If your response is, maybe we've got an old one, I think maybe it's covered, it's a bad look, because at that point OSHA doesn't know, are you just failing at PSM? Are you arguing with them that it's covered? I'd much rather you go in and say, here's the full set of PSM documents for this vessel, take a look at them. Or on the other hand, if it is your position that it is not covered, tell them directly right up front, it's not PSM covered. We don't have those. We have a justification for it. here's what it is. And just be clear, because what you don't want to do is get into the situation that Wynnewood found themselves in, where they had some PSM documents, they were missing some others. It was unclear whether the company itself, or at least OSHA made the case that the company was signaling that they thought it should be covered and just failing to do it. We thought it was the company doing their best to provide safety, whether even in a situation where it wasn't covered. But you can see how those sticky or messy situations can lead you to giving the agency some ammunition to possibly cite you for things. So we will leave that behind. I'm sure it won't be the last time you'll hear me talk about it, but it's enough for now. Very quickly, there is an emergency response rulemaking. It's not quite as, I'm sorry, it has actually been in the works longer than PSM rulemaking. So we just wanted to give you an update on that. This is one that we thought we saw some movement on during the last administration, but ultimately never made it across the line. Wanted to bring it up because it does touch a lot of your facilities. The real quick history here was, I think the NACOSH subcommittee, at least the work on this started all the way back in maybe 2007. I can't remember which iteration it was, but there was work going along there to try to come up with a new rule to replace the fire brigades rule. I think Jim Frederick mentioned that this morning, that this was something in the works. That NACOSH subcommittee issued a report in 2016. There is currently a SBREFA panel planned for later this fall. I believe there's some conflicting emails that I saw about that. It looked to me as if it was planned for 2018, but then I never saw it actually land. So I either missed them conducting a first SBREFA, or it just never actually got done that time. Once the SBREFA panel is concluded, or once the SBREFA process is concluded, there's no clear signal on timing what comes next. With that said, you have the with the SBREFA process going on, you have the ability to at least provide some input, whether you're a small employer or not. I'm sure people in some of the trade associations are. Wanted to flag some of the key issues and coverage here. Who is intended to be covered? Primarily, OSHA wants to cover those folks who regularly respond to emergencies. So probably of highest interest to you all are workplace emergency response teams. So if you have an on-site response team, they seem to fit under the provisions, at least the coverage provisions here. As we go down the list, some other folks that OSHA wants to cover, they also want to cover some folks who occasionally respond. The way it's framed in the documents right now is people who drive heavy equipment or things that might be used in a response. It doesn't seem to implicate other people, let's say at a refinery or a chemical plant, who aren't on the emergency response team, but who may respond. We'll be watching the language there to see if it seems to loop in people that are outside the two bullets here that we have that OSHA is clearly flagging they want to include. So we'll watch that one. In any case, these are the folks that they intend to cover. We have some interesting messaging from OSHA on this, and I think honestly, they're just not all the way through the process yet. It's not entirely clear how this is going to overlay with some of the existing requirements. As you know, when you are dealing with 119N emergency response requirements, and with HAZWOPER, right, you already face a host of requirements for training for your emergency responders and things along those lines. We've heard from some people at OSHA that this particular standard isn't meant to upset the current situation, that maybe this will be different. We're not entirely clear on that. So that's one reason why we flagged this here, something to keep your eye on. It's not entirely clear how OSHA is going to land that, and to what extent there will be overlapping requirements, or to what extent two standards may apply to the same people with just different provisions. Here are the main elements that they've listed for this SBREFA. Some things here you'll notice you're clearly already doing. Things related to planning and analysis. Those are things that showed up more in EPA's new RMP rule. things related to emergency incidents. I think we're expecting some additional requirements in terms of medical or fitness requirements. And then, of course, I think that some of these requirements will apply to facilities that perhaps aren't already doing this, that don't have PSM coverage or who are not already covered by HAZWOPER and those things. So it may be that this lands as a nice complement to HAZWOPER to just extend those covered, those elements that are covered there, but we'll see. And we'll leave it there. The last topic here that we wanted to cover is, of course, COVID-19. What are the effects on AFPM members? Aside from the number one effect of you're sitting somewhere that's not New Orleans, presumably participating in this conference. So that's the number one deleterious effect. All right, what's going on? So you probably know OSHA has a new COVID ETS. It only covers the healthcare sector. There are concerns, or one thing that we're watching is, okay, is OSHA going to extend that ETS to all of general industry? Originally, when they proposed the ETS, then they gave the draft to OMB back in April. It included language that essentially the hazard finding that said there is a hazard in every shared workplace in the U.S. It did not stop things at the healthcare sector. It actually said every workplace has this problem, and it included requirements that were going to apply to all industries, and it didn't seem to have any relief for smaller employees. And then, of course, at the last minute, we were all pretty surprised that the ETS, when it landed, was only applied to the healthcare industry. It was a last minute change. There's some rumors that maybe OSHA was not too pleased with how that happened. That it was more of a White House driven thing, and that might bear out. The timing kind of supports that, where we expected OSHA to deliver it. We thought it was there, and it paused for a long time. We thought it was going to be issued a month or two earlier than it actually was. So, okay. With that said, the ETS doesn't apply to general industry, but OSHA's decision to limit it to healthcare has been challenged by the AFL-CIO and others. If that challenge were successful, presumably it would force coverage of the ETS to go all the way to all the other workplaces, those that were originally intended to be covered. We're projecting a little bit on whether OSHA will vigorously defend these challenges. Perhaps there's a role for industry to jump in and on essentially OSHA's side saying you don't need to extend the coverage there. We've talked about the ETS with a few folks, and we've been asked the question: okay, if OSHA extends it to general industry, what happens? Can they just skip all of the things, the comments, the 6-month time period that they're facing with the healthcare version? And the answer we think is no. If they were to issue if they were to try to cover general industry with an ETS, they would need to do it anew. They would have to start a whole new process. Now, that said, they have a preamble basically already written. They have draft language. It wouldn't take the agency long to do that. They would just have to go through all of the steps that are required. So it is possible. Leaving aside the ETS for a moment, the OSHA has issued guidance that applies to general industry. We've fielded a lot of questions about this. Guidance is not a mandatory standard. It is different technically. With that said, they do have an active NEP. It doesn't apply to the critical infrastructure facilities that it used to. But there is this guidance, and that is a basis for issuing citations under the general duty clause. So, the question is asked somewhat frequently: is this, are we basically getting a backdoor rule here? Our answer is, well, it depends. It's not technically a rule, but there is this thing out there that you may have to comply with. All right, so we've included here, I'm just going to skip through things here, the suggested actions OSHA says you ought to do in your workplace. This is in the guidance that was issued and actually just updated a couple weeks ago. So go out and look at it. These are some major issues to cover. We've also got the slides here on the National Emphasis Program. Importantly, it no longer applies to non-healthcare critical infrastructure, but it has provided a lot of money and resources to OSHA to go out and do inspections. This last slide here is my gift to you, sanity tips for safety professionals during the pandemic. We've all been yo-yoed. It's been up, it's been down. Things are crazy. How do we ride this boat through these rapids? Some of these, you won't like some of these tips, but it's what we can offer. Number one, stay plugged into CDC guidance. Every time we have seen CDC lead OSHA. So if CDC goes there, OSHA almost certainly will. When CDC publishes something, that's your 2-week to 2-month warning. Here's what might be coming. All right. Another key thing is be able to explain the why for your COVID precautions. I have talked to so many people in so many organizations, and their leadership or their employees are saying, oh my gosh, why you keep changing the rules? What's going on? Well, if you're unable to explain why those rules have changed, even if you don't like them, if you don't necessarily agree with them, you're going to find that you're not able to quell the resistance, whether it comes from employees or from higher levels. We've been advocating for our safety professionals to be the conservative voice in your organization. I'm sure that the ops people will do a good job making the case that all these restrictions aren't necessary. That's their job. Your job as a safety manager is to be able to explain the trade-offs. If you go that way, if we don't use these precautions, here's the potential consequences, and make the case for the precautions. You may lose out on the end, but make the case, make it clear to everyone involved what the stakes are. We think you should absolutely plan for OSHA or other regulatory attention. Not everybody's getting an inspection from OSHA, but you've got to be ready for it. The worst inspections I've had to manage during this pandemic are the ones for the people who thought it would never happen. If you have an inspection after you're ready for it, you're going to get a complaint letter, and your response is going to say, yep, we thought about that. We knew about that. The employees complained. We dealt with it this way. We're done. OSHA is going to close it about 6 minutes after opening your letter, and you're done. That's it. You're in great shape. All right. Last two, don't lose sight of your non-COVID safety issues. That's not something I necessarily have to tell you, but some of the COVID guidance that we mentioned earlier is balance your COVID risk with your maintaining your other safety programs, but don't leave COVID behind. It's still a thing. It's still out there. And last is expect the worst, maybe not the worst, but at least worse, and you might be surprised. A lot of times, it's like, well, we're hopeful the pandemic will be over in 2 months. The pandemic will be over in 2 months or 3 months. We're almost out of this. We're almost out of this. Be prepared for the long haul. Buckle in. I know I didn't think 18 months ago that I'd be sitting here doing this summit, doing this conference remotely, but here we are. But stay strong, stay tough, and keep at it. Last thing, we've got a COVID-19 task force at our firm. We've got resources available if you don't know about already. Check out our blog, and that's it. I don't know if there are any questions, but I know we're about out of time.
Thank you, Micah. No, as of now, we don't have any questions, but really appreciate the presentation. With that, we'll see everybody tomorrow, and thank you for a great day.
Thanks. Looking forward to tomorrow.